Alright, welcome back. This will serve as kind of the home stretch, you might say, of our lectures for the semester here. I realize we're getting into finals week. I do want to cover some ground in the post World War II era and talk about essentially this kind of continued trend of convergence, even within the context of the Cold War, where you have these two superpowers beginning to really dominate world affairs or international affairs, but that in itself may be misleading because they are uh, quite frequently having to respond to um, events and conflicts outside of their kind of direct spheres of influence, particularly within the decolonization movements that are happening around the world from as early as 1945, 1947, all the way up to the early 80s and even beyond in some cases. So it is perhaps a little misleading to say that superpowers dominated. Instead, superpowers remained were able to, in many respects, keep conflicts from becoming you know world or global in scope, but they nonetheless had an interest in trying to influence outcomes in either these conflicts for, in the eyes of the colonial populations, independence, but in the eyes of superpower or kind of Cold War context, it was this battle between being free or communist in their orientation, and what the came to be known as kind of their alignment in kind of a world affairs, and being you had to be in one camp or the other. What we'll see is that for the these newly independent states that were coming on the scene, they really had, in many cases, no interest in playing into the communist or capitalist camp. They had every intention of advancing their own independent interests, and oftentimes they would play these two sides off against one another for their own individual benefit. So we refer to the Cold War era as a bipolar type of world, again between the United States and the USSR. But that's not to say that there wasn't a space and there wasn't a considerable opportunities for third parties and the kind of assertion of their interests into this world dynamic. So what I want to do is to try and talk about the Cold War here, the origins of it essentially, before moving on to other conflicts and how there is this emergence of the newly independent countries, the decolonization process, and how that's going to kind of begin to influence policy making between these contesting superpowers. I know it's kind of maybe a little amorphous, a little difficult to kind of a little intangible, I guess, but it's important to understand because it helps us hopefully understand the better the dynamics that we're dealing with here in the 21st century. So, with regard to the origins of the Cold War, here we'll be talking about the shift in America's understanding of its place in world affairs. Essentially, this rapid pivot from isolationism to internationalism, to becoming this superpower that is going to be basically proclaim itself as the champion of what came to be known as the free world. And it's this implementation of a new world order that began again during and after World War II. This required economic, political, and military leadership that by 1945 the United States realized that this was a role that the country was going to have to assume, and it was going to have to. It was you might say a reinvention of the United States, or a rededication of its ideas and principles, which had been largely focused on removing itself from the world, and kind of insulating itself, but now seeing that it was going to have to change its position, its point of view. This is again built on the foundations of Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points that came out of World War I. Notions of things like free trade, freedom of the seas, self-determination, and also establishing some institution of global governance. We saw that with the League of Nations, touching upon it briefly after World War I, and how it was very limited in scope, primarily because the United States was not a member of it, even though it was the US president that proposed it. But by 1945, we have basically a global governance and an institution 2.0 with the arrival and creation of the United Nations, which the United States would not only support, but also would become a key member, serving on the Security Council, which it continues to do to this day. So these ideals are going to be put into a more committed effect, but they're also going to be applied, of course, to benefit the United States as well. Key differences between World War I and World War II was that one, the enemies, the adversaries, Germany, Japan, had been thoroughly crushed. Italy as well. Peace was mostly non-punitive. That the utter destruction of these states was punishment enough, essentially, and that the world had learned its lessons from kind of assigning blame for world wars, or how these things play themselves out. There was also a public acceptance throughout much of the United States rank and file population, that global governance was a reality. It was going to be just a necessity, and that the United States needed to take a leadership role with that, within that reality, becoming a founding member of the United Nations. There was also an expert understanding of economic matters, and especially when it comes to international economics and international trade, and the responsibilities that come with that as a result. Again, if you're going to be a major political player on the world stage, then you're also going to have to be a major economic player on the world stage as well. And this all comes with responsibilities that the United States was not really prepared to take charge of after World War I, but by World War II, there was no alternative. It was also an ideological struggle following World War II. Again, you're seeing the world kind of begin to gravitate towards capitalist or communist orientations, between individual aspirations on the one hand and communal associations on the other. And this really consumed much attention in circles of American foreign policy making for the remainder, really, of the 20th century, up until the end of the Cold War in 1989. As far as economic globalization was concerned, and the establishment of a globalization as a concept, this began early on as the war began to was brought to an end. There was an early effort to implement the principles of the Atlantic Charter to establish a free market system. You'll remember that the United States was in possession of some 66% of the world's gold bullion after 1945. And so, very quickly, even before the war ended, as early as 1944 at the Bretton Woods Agreement and Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, leaders were coming together and beginning to scope out how exactly a post-war order was going to be created. It's at this Bretton Woods conference and the agreement that came from it that there would be a World Bank and an International Monetary Fund that would be created, that the United States would act as the major contributor to these funds. The World Bank began with a piggy bank, a treasury of some $6.7 billion. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, began with a reserve of about $7.3 billion. These two institutions, again global institutions, would be responsible for providing money for rebuilding Europe and Japan, and also be charged with stabilizing the world economy. The United States would decide how the money was to be spent, but other countries agreed to this and were happy in many cases that the United States wasn't attempting to isolate itself as it had after World War One. That it was tangible evidence that the United States was really going to embrace its role, its leadership role, and the responsibilities that came with it. The best way to basically try to cultivate individual aspirations to kind of promote freedom, promote liberal democracy, is by making sure that people are enjoy a certain standard of living. That very quickly people realized, experts in the field of foreign policy, of international economics, of global governance, came to understand that, hey, poverty can act as a petri dish for revolution, for unrest, for resentment and radicalization. These are things that would be in direct opposition to the principles of freedom and liberal democracy, that they would play into the hands of kind of communist ideology, focus on kind of revolution and things of that nature. So the United States wanted to create an infrastructure, a global infrastructure, in which money, funds would be allocated and distributed effectively to support the reconstruction, the physical reconstruction of countries, and therefore the kind of social rehabilitation of the populations themselves. Currencies would also be fixed in relation to the US dollar. Oftentimes this was done arbitrarily, simply because we're talking about economies that no longer functioned. One of the best examples of this was in the case of Japan. Its economy was just really wasn't an economy. The industrial centers in Japan had been obliterated. It had no means of really providing any type of goods or services to its population, and so powers that be in trying to re you know resuscitate the Japanese economy came to peg the Japanese yen to the US dollars at a ratio of 1 US dollar to 360 yen. 360 was picked again as kind of an arbitrary number because it was the number of degrees in a circle. Um, and these currencies, the Japanese yen and other nations' currencies, remained pegged and fixed for decades following World War II. And the United States eventually itself was on the gold standard, so its dollar was pegged to the amount of actual gold that was in its coffers. But by the 1970s, the United States moved off the gold standard. It's kind of peeking ahead, I know, but they moved off the gold standard, and currencies began to float with relation to one another. And that's what we have today, currencies that fluctuate depending on demand. So, and again, the United States, the US dollar remains one of the strongest, if not the strongest, currency in the world today. So that was in 1944 with this Bretton Woods conference that you were beginning to see these global economic institutions being created, or being kind of put to paper as far as what their responsibilities are and what they're going to be designed to do. By 1947, shortly after the war had ended, there's also passage or agreement to what's known as the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, GATT. This established procedures and principles for negotiating tariffs between countries, of course. GATT's goal was to reduce and or eliminate as many protective tariffs as possible. This is based on a non-discriminatory grounds. Countries essentially couldn't discriminate with regard to levying tariffs. They couldn't discriminate one country levy tariffs against one country and not others. As far as who, when it came to membership within GATT itself, so this didn't apply to the world as a whole, but it did apply to members that bought into and agreed to GATT. It's also important to remember or understand that the World Bank and the IMF, these were institutions again that were mostly focused on it was a collaboration between the United States that had healthy reserves of money and states that did not, and trying to redistribute that wealth. Now, when it comes to how that played into the emerging Cold War, Russia didn't, or the Soviet Union didn't want to buy into or commit itself or agree to the terms that were needed in order to have access to the funds within the World Bank and the IMF. And so, because they didn't do that, and also with GATT, because they didn't do those things, they had to go ahead and kind of create their own institutions to serve their own purposes, and those that allied with the Soviet Union. With regard to returning to GATT here, there was also a most favored nation principle that was carried through from our earlier discussions. But again, here, if you were a member of GATT, if you had agreed to this treaty, ratified it within your particular country, then you had to extend most favored nation status to if you did that with one country within that, and both those countries were members of GATT, then it applied to all members that were within the membership of GATT. Now, there were some exemptions to this. If there were pre-existing arrangements, and also if there were any future creation of trade associations. This is where you begin to focus or create more specialized or regional trade treaties or alliances with neighboring countries or countries within a particular region. Then they may have specialized terms that would apply to that network. That would be exempt from having to meet the threshold or meet the standards of GATT. So both of these early efforts, GATT and Bretton Woods, stabilized the world capitalist order as it began to come back into effect after World War II. It helped to rebuild old capitalist countries and also incorporate new ones as well. It also, in many cases, helped to stabilize colonial holdings. So you have countries like old imperial countries like Britain and France that began to use funds that to redirect funds not towards building their own countries back from the rubble, but actually using funds to try and impose order and sovereignty over colonial possessions that they had around the world. And this became obviously pretty contentious. I mean that again, the colonies had within these imperial structures or European within these old kind of European empires had contributed material, men. They had paid price and made sacrifices in order to see to the interests of victory in both World War I and World War II. And again, with peace now in effect, they were looking to get out from underneath of this kind of colonial type of existence and lifestyle. So this is going to really kind of be pretty contentious between the United States and its closest allies, France and Britain in particular, as in this period where you have this pivot from World War II into the Cold War. That many U.S. Advisors or bureaucrats and leading members of the government are going to say, look, Britain and France, you can't do this. You can't continue to redirect these funds. It doesn't, it's not what we're interested in trying to, preserve or extend as much of liberty and freedom and kind of independence as possible, and bring people into the liberal democratic orbit and get them away from the appeals of communism, and you're not helping matters by trying to reimpose your colonial oversight and autonomy or autocracy. So that was is a early kind of contentious issue here, and it really kind of helps as far as hopefully understanding the dynamics and the breakdown here, that you have a Soviet sphere of influence beginning to emerge over places like Eastern Europe, East Germany, China, North Korea, whereas the American sphere is going to begin to emerge in places like Western Europe and Japan as well. U.S. expansion of influence and interests was again done to primarily halt communism. One of its early advocates was a man by the name of George F. Kennan. He was a State Department official serving in the U.S. Embassy in the Soviet Union in 1946. And he's going to argue in a letter, a telegram essentially, that he sent back to his supervisors in Washington, D.C. He basically sent this long report or letter saying that the Soviet aggression itself fed off of international timidity. That if there was not a robust kind of line in the sand type of approach taken, if the United States didn't really adopt more of a hardline approach to negotiating or curtailing Soviet interests around the world, that the Soviet Union stood to seize power in places where there was an absence of power. That communism thrived in areas where there was a power vacuum, and he saw Moscow as the source of communist thought and action. So he believed, Kennan here is saying that communism is a monolithic threat. That is to say that communists around the world take their orders from Moscow. Now, what's going to happen is that over time, and very quickly over time, that is not necessarily going to be the case. That the Soviet Union is going to have to grapple with other communist countries and their leadership, and isn't always successful in keeping their own ducks in a row. The United States was already having trouble with that, with Britain and France, as we just saw. Kennan also believed that U.S. policy must, quoting here, must be that of a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies, unquote. So here he is laying out what we know today as the containment policy. That it's going to be kind of a long haul here, and that Kennan was saying that basically the Soviet model was, as he saw it, kind of doomed to failure, that it was going to collapse from within, and the best that the United States could do and should do is to basically put up a ring of friendly, Western-friendly states around the Soviet spheres of influence, and essentially contain it where it existed, don't allow it to expand any further, and just allow it to collapse in on itself. And this became the cornerstone of American foreign policy throughout the Cold War period, some 50 years or so in duration. As far as that policy, the containment policy being put into action, it had some early tests and hurdles that it had to overcome. One of the earliest of these occurred in 1947. You have where you have this beginning of a transition in the global balance of power from the United Kingdom to the United States. Now, Britain and France had been, even with money that they were receiving from these international institutions, even with that, they were so, their economic power, their ability to project military power around the world was so depleted that there was really no way that the British and the French could maintain their global empires, even with the funds that they were receiving. And so one of the best examples of these happened in 1947 in Greece, where a civil war erupted between communist and royalist forces. The UK, Britain, could no longer support the Greek monarchy that was fighting against communists, And so they called upon the United States for help. So the U.S., in response to the British call for help, issued on March 12th of 1947 what came to be known as the Truman Doctrine. And this is where Truman, addressing both houses of Congress, asked the legislative body for $400 million in economic and military aid for both Greece and Turkey, in order to shore up and start to create those friendly states, that were in close proximity to the Russians or Soviet sphere of influence. And so, if you lock down Greece and Turkey, if you bring them into the Western sphere of influence, then that is, an early step in the right direction to accomplish this containment policy laid out by Kennan. Truman described a bipolar world with totalitarian communism on one side and liberal democracy on the other. And so he linked world peace and America's freedom to preserving freedom around the world from armed minorities that sought to seize control. Congress goes ahead. It approves the money in May of that year. And also, there's an effort to extend U.S. economic aid to Western Europe as well. This is expressed, it's put into effect in June of 1947 in what's known as the Marshall Plan, named after George C. Marshall. And it was where there's a call for U.S. economic aid to help directly rehabilitate Europe, particularly Western-oriented parts of Europe. This is again done to combat things like hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. It was to, again, undermine the political radicalism that often occurs if these things were to, run rampant. Poverty, hunger, desperation, chaos. It was reminiscent of reformers of the 19th century, hoping to curtail domestic radicalism by providing resources for new immigrants, and so it's the same idea here being applied now internationally. Okay, so that the United States is again here stepping up to the plate when it comes to its the responsibilities expected and demanded, really, for a world power. As a result, under the Marshall Plan, the United States agrees to distribute $13 billion between 1948 and 1952. This results in industrial production in the countries that received Marshall Plan aid. The industrial production within those countries jumped some 64% during that 3 to 4 year period. So, again, it's it's the U.S. kind of being able to very, very rapidly, in the case of just 4 years, able to really help Western Europe pick itself up by its bootstraps, so to speak. This rebuilding of Western Europe raised new questions regarding Germany. There was after World War II, the Allies were of the opinion that they wanted to demilitarize and deindustrialize Germany. Again, Western Germany in particular, where Western troops, British, French, and American troops were stationed. This is done to keep Germany in check, keep it from rising up once again, and Europe having to face that threat. As the Cold War intensified, however, the West wanted to actually strengthen Germany. They realized that Germany could serve as a bulwark against Soviet aggression. And so, therefore, France, Britain, and the US consolidated power in western parts of Germany in the zones that they occupied. They issued a new currency. They called for a new centralized German government in the area where they had control. And really, this marked the early formation of a West German state. And so, again, the sphere of influence ran roughly right through Germany itself. In response, the Soviets tried to isolate Berlin, which was basically within, it was the capital, what had been the capital city of Germany before it got divided, and the city itself was divided into zones between the Soviets, the Americans, the British, and the French. Well, when the U.S., British, and French consolidated their zones into one whole, then into Western Germany, then they also consolidated their holdings in Berlin as well. And so this became West Berlin, this kind of you know, Western island within and surrounded by the Eastern and communist aligned orbit of within the sphere of influence. Well, in 1948, the Soviets tried to choke and starve the people within. They tried to choke supplies from going to Western Berlin. They tried to starve the population into submission. And Truman responds with a massive airlift of supplies and manages to, with about 1,400 flights per day going into Western Berlin, bringing some 13,000 tons of supplies, managed to keep the people fed, keep them warm in winter, managed to bring in the supplies they needed in order to continue to survive. And it marked an early, kind of defeat for Soviet efforts to try and crush liberal democracies. They ended the blockade in 1949. So you can see here the use of military and economic aid as exampled in the Berlin airlift, the Truman Doctrine, and the Marshall Plan. There was also an effort to enhance national security as well. The coordinating of international objectives meant that you needed to streamline the bureaucracy and the decision-making process. With the National Security Act of 1947, you have the establishment of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. Also, with this, you have the National Security Council coming into existence, and also the Joint Chiefs of Staff now are going to be organized. And so you have a organization of the various military wings as well: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. So this provided the president with a more efficient and effective way of decision making and getting advice in times of crisis. The gathering and processing of intelligence combined with the clearer channels relevant to the chain of command. This is designed to be more inclusive, and it was, but it's interesting to note that the Act consolidated control and decision making more in the hands of the executive branch in many cases. So that this is often seen as kind of in some circles kind of raised some eyebrows. you might say. Um, there were also the United States also committed itself to political and military commitments overseas. Best example of this was with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that came about in 1949, or known better as NATO. As the Cold War lines began to harden along and throughout Europe between East and West, the U.S. obviously dominated in Western Europe. The Soviets dominated in what became known as Eastern Europe, behind what was often termed the Iron Curtain. And so NATO was an effort to signify American leadership in collective security commitments. So this is a defensive alliance, NATO. If one member of country of NATO was attacked, then it was an attack upon all members of NATO. And so if one member of NATO was attacked, then all of them would come to the military aid and military support of that country against any adversary. What's significant about NATO is that this is the first time in American history that the country entered into a peacetime treaty that was outside the Western Hemisphere. And this is a treaty, obviously, that remains in full force today. And it's one that continues to grow, especially after 1989 and the fall of communism, the fall of the Soviet Union. More and more states want to become, nominate themselves or want to become members of NATO, and so NATO begins to move more and more to the east. It's one reason why today, in the current war in Ukraine, that there's among some circles an effort to try and get Ukraine to become a member of NATO, so that would up the ante for the Soviet or for Russia's wanting to or their commitment to continuing the war in Ukraine. Do they really want to go to? They can go to war with Ukraine, but if it's a part of a larger security agreement with the full backing of all NATO members, is that something that Russia would really want to concern itself with? And so that's kind of the debate that's still going on as well. As far as the Cold War is concerned in Asia, there was obviously this rather swift end to the war in the Pacific. The dropping of the two atomic weapons meant that the United States really had sole control over the rebuilding of Japan. General Douglas MacArthur was in charge of reconstructing a constitutional and democratic form of government, which he does. I mean, he's instrumental in trying to in drafting a constitution, working with the emperor to kind of make sure that there's this necessary institutions and civil society is in place to promote and enhance liberal democracy. Cold War battle lines did emerge, but they were really on the Asian mainland in places like China and the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. staked out a defensive perimeter, protecting U.S. interests in Japan, and the containment policy shifted this stance as conflicts intensified in the 1950 and onward, which we'll see when we talk about the Korean War. So uh, it's also important to understand that as all of this is going on, in 1947, you have India becoming an independent country. So the central uh, vital colony within the British Empire is now an independent state by 1947. Also in 1948, Israel becomes an independent country. Um, Jews that are interested in establishing their own independent state, um, they are they basically resort in many cases to terrorism. They bomb the David Hotel and basically attack the British forces and the UN forces there. And as a result of that, the British basically pull out their troops, and there's a war for creating an independent Israel by 1948 that has become a reality. And the United States is one of, if not the first country in the world to recognize Israel's existence and legitimacy as a independent state. So even in areas like the Middle East, the United States is going to have to begin to assume the uh, the issues that Britain had grappled with for so long, primarily between Arab and now Israeli interests, as far as right to exist, legitimacy, land claims and property, and security issues as well, as we'll see. So there is here a in the late 1940s this grappling and kind of you know a contested time in which there is not only an effort to try and shore up exactly who has influence where and in what form, but also there is, in the case of the United States and its closest allies, there are some very contentious issues that are having to be, kind of addressed and addressed immediately. That this is really creating more problems than it's solving as far as how Britain and France in particular are going about trying to secure their uh, global empires, with increasingly less and less effectiveness in doing so, and how this is just building up resentment among the colonized populations against the West. And so, and this is something that is runs counter to the containment policy that the United States has, kind of gravitated towards, and is by the late 40s really committed to putting into full effect. So what we'll do is continue to look at international developments, the Korean War, and also look at how the Cold War progresses, but at the same time you have the rise of new interests, kind of like through the non-aligned movement of the mid 1950s, and also get us toward the Vietnam War itself, as imperial interests versus independence movements really comes home to roost as far as the United States is concerned. Right? So that gets us through this kind of transitory period. Stay tuned for the follow-up lectures. All right, take care.